Hi, I'm Thom Ruhe of the Kauffman Foundation, and welcome to Top of Mind, our weekly program where I share news and information from the world of entrepreneurship. This week in Top of Mind, we'll be talking about Startup Chile, an exciting program happening in that country to attract and nurture startups, entrepreneurs that want to come there to start new and exciting companies. From there, we'll ask the interesting question, do CEOs necessarily make good presidents? And we'll finish off the episode talking about what it is an entrepreneur signs off for when they choose that path, and more importantly, if you're a spouse or a loved one of an entrepreneur, what do you need to expect for the lifestyle that your loved one has made? This is Top of Mind. So as we struggle to understand here in the United States how to attract and grow more entrepreneurs, one country in Latin America, Chile specifically, has figured out a formula at least that's showing some very early promise. Headed up by Chilean businessman Nicholas Shea, Startup Chile is a proclamation to the world that if you're an entrepreneur, consider Chile as a place to start. And to sweeten the pot, what they're doing is they're offering up to $40,000 in seed capital and a one-year visa to come on to Chile, start your company there, and get yourself immersed in the activity and the culture that they're trying to build there. So it was started in 2010, and to say that they've had some interest would be putting it ever so mildly. Specifically, they've had over 500 companies that have participated in the Startup Chile. 900 entrepreneurs have gone there, and they've come from over 38 countries. Now, it's a little too early to say that this is a raging success, but we know from early indications and other historical examples around our own country that this is going to be a good thing, in a whole host of areas like job creation and economic growth. And it really is a context when you hear in this country the debate that rages around immigration. Research at the Kauffman Foundation is very clear on this point, that immigrants are a great catalyst for entrepreneurial activity. And at least in the case of Chile, they're really doing what they can to catalyze that and attract them there. So as Chile figures out how to attract executives to its shores, here in the United States, we're trying to pick a chief executive for our country, which begs the question, at least as it's been framed in this year's election, does a good executive necessarily make a good president? If you've been watching the debates and hearing any of the rhetoric that's going out there, obviously fundamental to the conversation around the health of the economy has been the question of employment and job creation. So as I think about this subject, you look at what does a company do and a company executive. As they grow successful companies, a part of their job, a big part of their job, is to drive revenue, profits specifically. Now, as they're in a growth phase, employment growth kind of follows. But is it the core mission of what an executive does? One could argue that the job growth is really a byproduct of their growth ambition and not necessarily a goal. So for instance, if the fate of the company turns because something in the economy does, the first thing a good executive does is cut jobs, because that's what they're charged to do. Optimize, cash for the shareholders, and cutting costs is a big way they do that. Now, I'm not sure how you can do that as a president. As I kind of consider this even further, and I have to give credit to the New York Times magazine. They're the ones that really came up with this first article about this, specific to this year's election, which I'm not going to get into, namely, this is not a red or blue issue for us. As I turn my thoughts to this subject, I've reflected more so on what helped me be a good entrepreneur and whether or not a good entrepreneur would make a good president. So think about what an entrepreneur needs to do. First and foremost, they have to deal with a tremendous amount of ambiguity. The uncertainty that comes with entrepreneurship. You don't know where the next threat is. You don't know where the next opportunity is. You need to be able to understand how to optimize limited resources. Now, this is certainly a big point of contention in deficits and budget deficits and national debt. You really don't even get off the ground starting a company if you don't understand how to leverage in a much better way, resources. The growth of the firm as an entrepreneur, you don't have anything. So it's putting people to work. That's where the value of the company is derived. So, I might ask the question a little differently and ask out there, what was the last really great entrepreneur that we had as a president? For that matter, what makes, a good entrepreneur, one part that I would look at from an experiential base myself is one of the things that helped me most to be an entrepreneur was my service in the Air Force. Military service is, I think, one of those things that is very well suited for some of the characteristics I already mentioned, tolerance for ambiguity, understanding focus around mission and execution. So I'm sure, the public will figure that out. They'll get their chance to weigh in on whether, an incumbent should get a second term or an executive should get a first term. I might change that discussion somewhat to say, hey, let's aspire someday to put an entrepreneur into the White House. Another area that entrepreneurs have to do is they need to understand how to leverage innovation. So I would think, like, what would an entrepreneur do coming into commander-in-chief position? Well, one thing for sure is they take inventory of all the programs, the functions that the government provides, and understand how certain things could be leveraged, more efficiently. Where could we use technology? If there's one thing that we produce as a nation, it's a lot of intellectual property. We've got firepower there. I have no doubt that an entrepreneur would look at a way to unleash, the value of that intellectual firepower that we have. So whether I'm an entrepreneur seeking just a new house or the White House, one thing you can't escape is that choosing a lifestyle or choosing the entrepreneurial life, so to speak, it's not an easy one. It's not one that's taken lightly by the entrepreneur. But there's another person or people that have a role in that as well, and that's the family networks, the spouse, the significant other, the family members that love that entrepreneur, that have the unfortunate burden of loving an entrepreneur. For too many, that decision that their loved one has made has implications to them as well. And for those that really have gone down that path, I actually have, a couple words of advice. I actually wrote a blog post on this that appeared some while back on our blog on entrepreneurship.org, the E360 blog. But, first of all, you need to understand this is a calling. This is not an arbitrary decision that they make, a loose one, right? There's some catalyst in their life that got them to the point where they have said, we're going to go do this. And I mention this in particular because I think sometimes, those with good intentions want to question the entrepreneur. Like, so why are you doing this? And I think too often they come across as questioning from a point of, like, it's almost it was a lightly, a decision that was made lightly by the entrepreneur, that they just kind of came to it almost arbitrarily. And, oftentimes I've seen these conversations take on a tone where the entrepreneur is offended. And, it's all a big misunderstanding. Nobody means anybody ill in this equation here. But understanding that it's really a calling that they're fulfilling, something deep within them, is the first step. The next step would be, you really have to expect the unexpected. Things come at an entrepreneur, good, bad, and otherwise, at all kinds of angles. So you're never really sure as you kind of, engage with your entrepreneur what kind of a day they were having. There will definitely be, ups and downs, and really, understanding that as part of the course that they're on goes a long way, and it really goes to my third point, and that is offering encouragement, or as I like to say, kind of tongue-in-cheek, have you hugged an entrepreneur today? Because I can tell you from personal experience, starting a new thing can sometimes be one of the loneliest things, or at least you feel lonely in the early days. You question yourself on whether or not you're doing the right thing. You're charting, uncharted waters. You're going out there alone. You haven't usually gotten anybody to follow you yet, whether that be in the form of employees or new customers to believe in your product or service. That encouragement so often makes the difference on how hard or how easy that journey is going to be. So, for those of you that are out there in those roles, please understand this and offer them the encouragement that is, it's food for them. It really is. It's chicken soup for their soul, if you will. The final piece of advice I have for you in this very important role, and this is very important, so please hear this, You have a function. You are the gatekeeper, because there will be no shortage of people in your social networks and circles that will tell your entrepreneur, and they'll be oh so well intended, at least it'll come off in that guise, but they'll be so eager and willing to tell your entrepreneur why they shouldn't be doing what they're doing, or planting other little seeds of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Your job is to be a gatekeeper. Understand those that would detract. And now, let me be clear, I'm not saying keep bad news or things that they need to know away from them. If there are things that impact the business, if there are things that are fundamental to what they're trying to accomplish, they absolutely need to know that. That's part and parcel of growing a business. I'm just saying those that would hurt or pull down your entrepreneur for no good reason, just keep them at bay. Because in the very limited resources that they have, because really the family life, I'm sorry to say this, it is secondary, to most people who start down that path. So what is left over from an attention span and bandwidth standpoint, they don't need to be giving to somebody that would just hold them back. So that's it. Those would be my points of advice. You can read more about it on our blog, as I mentioned earlier. But I think being there for them, and if you can see it through, I promise you on the other end, when that success comes, you'll feel like you owned a piece of that and a part of it, and you'll both enjoy it more for that experience. So, when I think of myself personally, some of the experiences that my wife had to kind of go through, the ups and the downs that we had through multiple companies that, I had participated in, startups, there were definitely lean times, and especially I think about around the holidays, right? Typically that's gift-giving time, that's visiting, that's entertaining with friends, and, there were several seasons that came and went where, I had to say to my wife, Santa is going to be a little less generous this year, or, I'd love to buy tickets to that charity ball, but at, $500 a head, it's not in the budget. It's not even close to being feasible at this moment. Now, she hung in there with me, and, when we got out of certain companies and exited, and, I got to go to the bank with a pretty nice sized check, I got to make the comparison to say, remember when? This is why we did that then, and here's the rewards for it now. So it all comes with it. It's part and parcel. Stress points on our side as the entrepreneur, another personal example I would share with you is I remember in one of our companies, we got to a point where growth was great, but cash flow became a problem. And so we needed operating cash. Specifically, we needed, a line of credit. And we went to the banks and we did all the natural sources. And, we were fortunate. We found a bank that would actually give us that line of credit, with the catch that the partners all had to personally guarantee it, which means we personally put our signature to a $1.5 million line of credit, stipulating that if we should fail, and if we should fail to repay, all of our personal assets were subject for claim. In other words, any equity I had in my house, any life savings, my college kids' funds, all of that stuff would be subject to them to collect if we ever defaulted on this line of credit. I was so anxious signing this, and we really had no choice. I mean, the partners, we all had to kind of just, suck it up and do it. But it took me 2 months before I could muster up the courage to tell my wife what I had done. Needless to say, that was a memorable dinner that night. But then, I think my wife kind of just came around to understanding that, well, we're not in this thing to be anything less than successful. If it did fail at the catastrophic level that would become an issue, the fact that I might be starting over financially would probably have been the least of our concerns. So at the end of the day, she kind of saw it the way the rest of us did, and it certainly became a motivation for us to be even more successful. So thanks for tuning in to Top of Mind, stories about entrepreneurship and information from around the world of entrepreneurship. Next week, I'll be on location with an exciting new startup and entrepreneur. The company is the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. The founder, Gary Schoniger, is author and architect of an exciting new entrepreneurship curriculum program that the foundation has partnered with to produce and is distributing internationally now. There are, in fact, students from around the world that are participating in the Ice House Entrepreneurship Mindset program. So we'll be on location next week, learning some things from Gary and understanding what reach and impact we're having with this exciting new curriculum.